All right, I think we're about ready to get started. I know there's some people still trickling in, but I just want to give a warm welcome and a quick introduction before we get started today. So this seminar is jointly hosted by the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management Department and the Global Change Fellows. And if anyone's unfamiliar with the Global Change Fellowship, it's an initiative of the USGS Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, where they sponsor a cohort of students financially, scientifically, and with professional development opportunities. And that cohort is 12 of us. And as part of that fellowship, we put on these seminars periodically throughout the academic year. So this is the third seminar in our series, and we are so excited to be able to host this one in person. So welcome to everyone who's here and to everyone who's joining us on Zoom today. Just a few reminders, do us a favor and silence your cell phones if you're in the seminar space. Save your questions for the end of the presentation. There will be plenty of time to do a Q&A and discussion afterward. And if you're joining us over Zoom, you are more than welcome to send your questions at any time. Just know that we won't address them until the end of the presentation. And you can send those questions either to the group at large or the chat moderator. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julianne to introduce our speaker.
I'll just talk about it. Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. As everyone said, I'm Julianne Reese. It is my honor and pleasure to be able to introduce a very special guest to you today, Mr. José González. And José is a huge force in the outdoor inclusion space. His work in bridging culture, identity, and the environment through education, community engagement, science communication, and art is incredibly impactful. José may be best known for his work in founding Latino Outdoors, a Latinx-led organization that is now 10 years old this year that he mentioned this morning. And they work to engage Latino communities in the outdoors. But José's work expands beyond this, and he is more recently a co-founder of the Outdoorist Oath, an organization that provides a way of being and doing for outdoorists to explore and think about the intersections of planet inclusion and adventure. And he also has done significant work as a consultant for many various organizations and communities. He earned his bachelor's in history at the University of California, Davis, and his master's in behavior education communication at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and the Environment. He has been featured as Bay Nature's 2021 Community Hero and is a recipient of the National Wildlife Foundation's National Conservation Education Award, Muri Center 2016 Rising Leader Award, and the Kenji Award. And I'm very excited to introduce him to you all today for what I know will be a very inspiring and interesting discussion. So without further ado, José.
So I'll attempt to project, and if you can't hear me, let me know. So use the microphone, and that will be the same for on Zoom. So presume that if you can't hear me as clearly, please send a query question to the people monitoring it. So first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Start by the introduction, José González, although my full name is actually José Guadalupe Adonis González Rosales de León. Found it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. He, him, his, though I'll respond to anything offered with joy and respect. Currently live in traditional, ancestral, occupied, stolen, and unceded lands in the Eastern Southern Maidu and Miwok, among many, many others. California has a particular and specific, very tragic history when it comes to Native communities. And then as I'm here in front of you, my access needs are being met, but I name that just in case that if there's anything I can do to support your access needs, let me know in terms of communicating, projecting, and so forth. And then lastly, just to be clear, I consent to you taking anything that I say today and posting it on social and like. There's a handle if you want to attribute as well. And before I kind of take it off, we have allocated a lot of time for Q&A today at the end. So just know that, like, hopefully and ideally we'll have enough time for questions and conversations. And as I'm going through things, if there's a comprehension check where you're just like, I lost you, I don't it gets in the way of you being able to continue with what I'm saying, it's okay, raise your hand or ask it, and then maybe that can help. Just know that I don't want you to feel like you lose half of what I'm saying because you have an urgent question. So that's quite a bit to throw out at the front, but I just want to set that up as I go through a couple of things. And I started because I'm really grateful for the invitation. And we had the title Inclusivity in the Outdoors. And that's kind of be an entry point in terms of the work that I currently do, how I started really into this most recent phase of the work that I do and how it's expanded and how I kind of move with it. So I'll look at unpacking what do we mean by inclusivity, what do I mean by outdoors, and how I'm using that as a practice that connects both, quote unquote, the outdoor world with a lot of our social cultural work. So when I use terms like diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice oriented, it's really about how are we creating the conditions of like the full diversity of our communities and the totality of you, we get to be in a thriving future together. Which is easy to say and for me always sounds amazing, but getting there sometimes feels like we're just gonna go to that peak over there. Like great, and then we begin the journey and know that there's quite a bit that we need to do to get there. Before I start off, are there any quick questions that are top of mind?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got kind of three general chunks. One of the things that I do is kind of been leaning into the language of ecology. So I won't have a straight linear sequential like A, B, and C. It'll be more like A and then a little meandering and a little B and then a C. It's all meant to be connected, but it's less of a pipeline and more of a braided river. Like earlier today with the group. But it's also a good way for me to remind about how I approach the work as connectivity. And so I'm going to start a little bit quickly about me, and some of the frames that I use and how I engage this work, and along with some examples and practices. So what does that look like in terms of how I do this? And so I share that I'm currently living in Sacramento, but I'm actually an immigrant from Mexico. Grew up in the state of Nayarit, was born rather in the state of Nayarit, came over to the US at the age of 9 and did the rest of my growing up in California in the Central Valley. If you're not familiar with the Central Valley, it's basically the agricultural center of California and what the Farm Bill designates as, I forgot what the term is. There's a specific policy term, which basically means the food we actually eat, as opposed to all the other crops that we grow for other stuff. I always found that funny, that in the Farm Bill is like, and other food or other crops. So like, that's actually all the frustrating. So that informed a lot of my growing up, both in what I call my own cultural wayfinding, like how do I identify? What does it mean for me to be me in a space? What does it mean to use the term Latino in the US? Because I didn't have that growing up. I became Latino once I came to the US. And I shared my name at the beginning as José González or José Guadalupe, Adonis, González, Rosales de León. But I wasn't even José until I came to the US. And what I mean by that is in Mexico, I went by Lupe, after Guadalupe. It's a pretty androgynous name. I have the same name as my dad, José Guadalupe González. My mom added the Adonis in there because she said, I want you to have one that's just for you. And so I went by Lupe. And coming to the US, the first questions was, what's your first name? I said, well, Jose, but I go by Lupe. No, we have to go by your first. So that's how I became Jose. I already was Jose, but that's how I kind of became more of Jose. And then working my way through systems like the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, the Social Security Administration, all of those. Well, what's your last name? González Rosales. Was Rosales your dad's last name? No, that's my mom's last name. In Mexico, we have both of them together, and dad and then mom. Like, well, we need to go by your dad's last name. And so that was, when I talk about like entry into a social cultural space, that's an example of what I mean about how you begin to compromise and navigate who you are in a space that's telling you, but how do you fit in? This was me as a kid, later in high school and so forth. And so as we try to think about how this could be different for the future, to both be more inclusive and representative of the strength of diversity, it means how do we design some of these systems so that they're still there for a purpose and intention, but they're not asking segments of the community to be less of themselves, while it doesn't ask the same of others. And that's what we mean about the comparison when we say a dominant culture versus not. So I'll talk more about that. That was my first experience without knowing that was. And so that process of reclamation, like how do I continue to be? It's part of the work that I do, and it shows up in various ways. And then the last piece on this about me, a lot of the times, and especially early on, we would ask, so what term do I use? It's a Latino, it's a Latina, it's a Latinx, is it Hispanic, is it Mexican? And depending on the day, I'll have a different answer, but often say yes. That doesn't answer it. Yeah, it does. Sometimes I say, if it helps you, I'll say I'm Mexican by birth nationality. I'm a US citizen through naturalization. I'm Latino through social cultural identity. I'm Chicano through social political identity, and I'm Hispanic by census count. That's meant to be with some humor. And I can be all of those because the idea is for me to be able to ask in service of what? If it's in service of causing harm, then it's not, that's not my association. But if it's in recognizing that different people have a starting place and we can be aligned to a common goal, that's how I want to be in community. And so I share this because all of our starting work with Latino Outdoors was that word. If it would have been just purely up to me, I would have called it raza, which might mean something to some of you, might not to others. But we were like, let's try to acknowledge the strategic compromise we wanted to do, which was if I went by raza outdoors and then the National Park Service isn't going to want to work with us. They're going to be like, I don't know what's going on there. I want to be involved. And if we went by, say, the Hispanic Conservation Council, we were going to get a segment of grassroots community organizations that'd be like, I'm sorry, that is way too colonized for me, I can't do it. And I was like, I don't want to spend my time and energy on having those debates, which are important. I want to be able to create a connecting space, which meant that on the best of days, we were able to facilitate some of those conversations to say, regardless of the term, how is our work aligned together? On the worst of days, it means we would get it from both sides, which is also part of that work. So just kind of putting that in there so that as I move today, those are some of the recognitions in terms of language to use, how we show up, and really what the questions that I ask to think about where do I want to invest the energy and how am I honoring how people self-identify versus how maybe labels are being. All right, not seeing any good. Continue, not seeing any access needs of comprehension. Things coming up. So my most kind of recent work is centered around the idea of healing severed connections. And by healing severed connections, it acknowledges a few things. One of them is that, what do I mean by connections? What is our reconnection to nature, to land? What has that process been and what has been that severing? What does healing mean? What does it mean to have healing centered work in relation to trauma informed work, as opposed to like not taking it all into account? And so this was my attempt, like kind of do like Michael Pollan did with his food work, which was, I don't know if any of you are familiar, it was like eat food, not so much, mostly plants, mostly vegetables, I think somewhere along those lines. And it was a way to try to encompass a lot of the big ideas in the little kernel. Be with nature, as nature, in radical and revolutionary balance. So the be with nature is all of the work as to how are we in nature. But then as nature, as a challenge to that separation that has historically relatively recent occurrence that we're separate from nature. And if we hold that separation, then it's very different than thinking about how we are as part of nature. We're still unique in our human beingness, for sure, but it can lead us into a different path than just thinking, right, I am the human and the nature's out there. And then the radical and revolutionary balance is really looking at how we are both interdependent, but what do we mean by being in regenerative cycles? So I say that because then I start with some of these words. So radical, the root of the word radical is root. Just like in Spanish, raíz. And so I use this as a start because when I think about our work being radical and revolutionary, rather than thinking of radical as kind of being out there on the outside, causing disruption, and then people wondering, quote unquote, why are you rocking the boat? I'm thinking more as radical as being at the root of our work, here, grounded. And so we're radical in a way by returning to kind of, I think all of us involved in some form of nature access, nature movement, outdoor equity, conservation, we're there because we have a care and love for these spaces. And we have a particular relationship to the land that we're trying to maintain. And so for me, I think about that in the way that we can be radical in how we do this work. So just like the first root. And revolutionary, thinking about the kind of root of the word being around revolutions and thinking cycles. So how are we revolutionary? By supporting and being part of regenerative cycles, as opposed to breaking and harming those cycles, which is what tends to get us in our kind of environmental problem. So like climate change, for example, is how we are breaking or affecting or impacting the carbon cycle. And so it helps me think about, how am I part of the work to support regenerative cycles, so that ideally we can both be with nature, but as nature, connected to some of the regenerative cycles that have been part of nature and kind of what keeps us going, creates this biome and this part of what I see as part of the work of the future that we try to create. Because if we don't, then I think the path is more or less relatively clear. The planet's going to be fine. We're not. The planet might exist in some form of fashion for the next, 5 billion years before the sun goes into the That's a long time ago. But over the next 100 years, it's a question of how are we going to be in relation to and adapted to the realities of climate change. And so an entry point into that is like a lot of this conceptual work isn't new. It isn't radical in the sense of like hanging out from nowhere. It's radical if it's grounded in a lot of ancestral and traditional knowledge. And that the invitation is how does that couple with the value add of quote unquote Western science rather than being in contradiction? Because if kind of the Western Eurocentric view of science becomes the default for the one that gets to dictate all of it, then we can find ourselves in a little bit of trouble about only valuing our relationship to land, to nature, and to each other in a way that is reductive, that is limiting. And so this comes from the National Science Foundation collaborative project, the Cosmic Serpent, which was looking at what happens when we put relationship between indigenous worldviews, example from Native communities in the US, with traditional Western Eurocentric scientists. How can it be in relation to each other? And I say this because the report that they produced, they actually lay it out for you and they say, If you want to read this as a quote unquote traditional science paper, here's the linear path to follow. But we also crafted the report, so if you want to read it from an indigenous worldview, here's a circular path that you can follow. It's a really neat and fascinating kind of invitation that gets you to look at the same content. And here's how we're inviting you to engage with it beyond just one way that you want to do this. So some of the contrasts here is, I won't read through all of them, but for example, Western Eurocentric worldview. The first one is kind of saying, although some kinds of culturally valid knowledge and practices are at odds with science, a growing body of published research shows that some of the knowledge derived from varied cultures and contexts provides valid and consistent scientific interpretation. A lot of that you see nowadays in news articles that says, like, Western science validates what the community knew for 10,000 years. The indigenous worldview is spirituality is embedded in all elements. Additional component that I add to this is that part of the work and the goal is systemic change. By systemic change, I mean that what we have in place can be and look and be redesigned differently. The way that we move in the world, the systems that we have in place can be different than how they were before because we designed them, we created them. You take this university campus and it seems relatively fixed in the sense that if I were to ask, let's just do away with half of the buildings, people are like, you can't just do that. There's so much in the way of making that happen. And yet there was a point where none of those buildings were there. We played, and by we I mean humans as a whole, and specifically a subset of people with resources and power, created the conditions to have these buildings in place. And so when I think about systemic change, it is that type of re-envisioning different, but knowing that it's dual because we played a role in creating. And so this is from the FSG Water Systems Change as a way that I think about it. If I'm going to engage in systemic change, there's at least 3 elements that I look at. A lot of what I'm currently doing right now is in the mental models, so that hopefully can facilitate some of the elements. Also in the relational change, and how that supports policy change in the structural. The structural is explicit in terms of like you can kind of see it or not. For example, a policy. Do you have a policy that provides more equitable access? Do you have a policy that invests or directs to invest more in, for example, renewable energy? Practices, it's kind of a little bit of culture. You get to know and see, and it's clear if you have a practice that is equitably and inclusive. And then resource flows, money. Do you have a budget for it? Is it in the budget? You might say this is important to us and say, great, what funds it? And if not there, don't be surprised if it doesn't happen. Relational, semi-explicit because it's there, but it also takes a little bit of more work to tease out. So relationships and connections, power dynamics, trust. Sometimes if I were to ask you, do you trust this individual? You say yes or no. Maybe half yes, maybe half no. But if asked why, what are the indicators to you why you trust this person? We have to do a little bit of work to be like, okay, what does that look like? What is telling me that I can ground it on that? Power. Like, great. Sometimes use the expression power dynamics often. I could be like, all right, show me what are the power dynamics in the room. I would ask, draw them out for me. What do they look like? It's that type of work that we can say, well, I think there's power here because of the title. The person that gets to decide if the budget is approved or not. There's title here based on structural privilege. Research shows that if you're from this gender compared to this gender, your ideas are going to be valued and heard more. Is it fair? Not a question if it's fair or not. It's what the research is showing is happening. It could be power in terms of relational networks. You are a valued member of the community and people listen. They're willing to hold more space of trust to hear what you want to say compared to somebody else. So those are some of those examples. And then the mental model says implicit, it's the harder one because it's the harder to really assess, which is what is the mental model of how the world works that you hold? And maybe you never interrogated it because you move in the world and it all makes sense to you. The question is, what if that worldview is very different from somebody else? It's very different in the way you haven't experienced it. And then you get to connect those. How does that work unfold? So an example of that showed back here is some of these examples of worldviews. What does it mean if wisdom and ethics are derived from direct experience with the natural world? Comparative wisdom and ethics are derived from what we can count and measure. So those are some of those examples. And this can be transformative. I think of it as conceptual change, but it can be transformative because it's asking you to do a mind shift. It asks deeper questions as to what is normative and why, and how can it be more inclusive and expansive of that. Sometimes we say, if I move throughout the world and it all makes sense to me, I don't have to think about something that's accessible to me. That's usually an indicator that it is normative for you. And to think about how that could be different for somebody else. One of, I think, an easier example is when we take about physical disability. We have the ADA passed in 1990, if I recall. So there's a structural change right there, a policy. You actually needed a law. Relational change, meaning that many families, had someone that had a physical disability, so it was very real. And you begin to make that a little bit more normative in terms of not having it be that someone also is just disabled, that they may not have the same access that you can, but they're very able to do so many other things. So that led into the mental model about being able to think about how can the spaces all be different with that incorporation, and then that can be a value add. So in one of the case studies that we have is called the curb cut effect. I don't know if you're familiar with it. What it was looking at was when you got the sidewalks and then you get to an intersection at a street corner at the curb, you can cut it so that it slants down like a mini ramp into the street so that it provides wheelchair access to this. And so the question there would be, well, is that fair that we're focusing these resources and intention on a small group of people? And for me, the answer is yes, but I'm playing into how sometimes people say, well, what do we mean by fair or not when it comes to policy changes and resources? But what the curb cut effect was saying, not only is it equitable in terms of fair that we should provide this to a community that needs this access, what we then find is that a lot of other people get to benefit from it, like the grandma walking down, the mom with the stroller, the kid on the bicycle. And so it actually has a community benefit to it. That leads into the work that we sometimes talk about, like designing at the margins. And when you actually pay attention, do some of the work with intention with those that are considered marginalized, it can actually have a community benefit. An example in terms of what we mean about some. Actually, I'll go to this one first. The second one is when we often talk about like diversity, equity, inclusion, justice work, access, regardless of the acronym. I often say we start with kind of a few realities that we can ignore them or try to ignore them, but it doesn't change the facts what they are. And in the US, one of those is demographic inevitability. The demographics of this country will look like in 2050 is very different than 19. And rather than it being something that's fear-based or zero-sum, it's actually a value add. It has the strength of diversity. And so what we're noticing is kind of regardless of the different sources and data sets, we see that increasing diverse representation. So here by 2050, here also kind of by 2050, such that the current kind of census estimate, I think it's like 2042, between 2042, 2050, we'll have what's called a minority majority country. And so for me, the work is great. How are we best suited and we embrace like
I'm trying to uncover your,
how do we prepare for it? How do we work with that in a way that actually values the strength of diversity in ways that shouldn't be shocking to us? Because when you do any kind of conservation-based work, you know the value of biodiversity. Like you know what it means to have a thriving ecosystem that has that biodiversity. I imagine few ecologists go out and say that's a beautiful monoculture of a forest. Unless you want to just cut out the wood, but that is a different purpose and intention. And that's why I often say I lean to the language of ecology, because we have some connection to these ideas and concepts. And yet when we like try to engage with them with people, we sometimes we're like, I don't get it, I don't understand, I don't know what it is. And that can be fair, because we also culturally have not created a lot of conditions to really engage with that work. Where's the mouse?
sorry.
Oh, no, you're good.
Now I need to mess you up.
It's okay. There we go. This is from the Redlining Institute over in California. And so I share this because for me, the term itself, it's important, it has value, but it's not where I want to center the work. It's like, well, what's the exact definition of diversity? What's the exact definition of inclusion? Why is it just as included now, but it wasn't in the 1980s? And so I grounded in this demographic shift, as well as one of the questions that I often use, which is in service of what? And so this can be helpful as an example to kind of acknowledge that, think of the 1960s civil rights movement. It's actually a few components, but for example, the African-American Black civil rights movement. When we talk about a structural change, you had the reality that you had doors that were labeled that if you are white, then this is for you. And if you're not, then this is not for you. So you have individuals within a generation that this was the reality. And you could see that change. We no longer have that in terms of the explicit physical label on doors or water fountains in schools and so forth. And just because you have that policy change doesn't mean that the mental models just kind of flip just in the same day as when you sign the laws. You needed to be able to have the time and the work to really think about what does this mean to be in a different relationship with each other than what was enforced before. So hence the tolerance kind of component, which is, all right, I can accept that we might not have segregation, but I'm not there in terms of the mental model. And yet, as we increase the demographic shift in representation, we kind of saw multiculturalism and awareness in the 70s, 80s into the 90s, where you get a lot of more of kind of the cultural diversity appreciation and celebration. You get an increase in the heritage months, for example. And then diversity into kind of, this is already a little outdated, present day, it's justice oriented. Now it's looking at to be able to say, it's not just the presence of difference. It's now what's happening as that presence of difference is in decision-making spaces and spaces of power. As an elected official, the head of an organization, on a board. And it doesn't mean that by being in that position of power, then all of a sudden everything changes. It means now, how do people react to that in a way that they're prepared for? And when we're not prepared for them, not surprisingly, we act out of spaces of I think of like negative emotion, which to me makes sense because you fear you're losing something. When you prepare for them, you kind of really be able to see what your role is in the future that we're making. And this is, to me, is easy to say, but incredibly hard to do. Because as humans, we have the cognitive biases to react to survival. So this is your fight and flight mode. We have the evolutionary adaptation that if something feels threatening, we react accordingly and we close to our heart. So creating those spaces, what I think of like the open heart and open mind, to be open to difference, to a different worldview, to a different experience, to different relationships, takes work. So that's often when we do a lot of the work around cognitive implicit bias, to be ever enter those spaces to both understand but also. This is the work of Charles Thomas, who's the current executive director of Outward Bound Adventure, not the same as Outward Bound, based off the work of the researcher's name Nichols, I believe, which was looking at cultural difference. But this is an adaptation curve. Like sometimes when you see it in technology, like who uses the iPhone first, and then who, after it's been cool for a while, then also gets an iPhone. So it's an adaptation curve or a user curve. And this can be helpful because in the intentional users, the early adopters, this says where most environmental organizations go for diversity. It can be easier to be here because it's already familiar. Oh, you like hiking too? Awesome. And you come from a different community lived experience, but we both love hiking. Let's go. Intentional non-users have a variety of reasons for not wanting to be a part of it. And you can have organizations that engage there because it's hard. Or you might try it and you hear from the community, nope, thank you, bye. And you're like, oh, I guess they're not interested. It could be. There's lots of us that aren't interested in things that you might be excited and passionate about. But it can also mean that it's an indicator that there's deeper work in there. And it's easier to just tell them no. Because their trust isn't there. Their relationship's not there for me to really sit down and say, this is why it's really hard for me. I want to go with you on this experience. If you're willing to sit with that and like really receive, not challenge, not question, not try to diminish, but receive the reality of when we talk about like historical and generational trauma. And so that's where a lot of the hard work is. As an example of that, two of them here. So this comes from the Outdoor Foundation, through the Outdoor Industry Association, which does some participation tracking around demographics. So this was, I think there's an updated one already, but it's the trend's about the same. So participation rates among diverse groups over time. The green line is the self-identified or the identified demographic for Black community, blue for Hispanic, red for Asian, yellow for white. And so you can see this gap. And question, just like when we started Latino Outdoors, and we get the question, Latino, how can we get Latino communities to be more interested in the outdoors? Well, let's flip the question and say, how are they already interested in ways that you don't know? Because if I only accept this as a lack of interest, I could be reinforcing a lot of this and not knowing. And an example of that, this is from the 2017 Nature of America study. Just one study, but I like it because it has some of these questions that present that contrast. So the question was, how would you rate your interest in each of the following activities? For example, interest in hiking. So when you ask for interest in hiking, this is what was reported. So for the lowest at 19% was for demographic Black identity. And so the takeaway that they presented there was interest in hiking is lowest among Black adults. And yet, if you ask the same question, but not hiking, but rather walking outdoors, they all shoot up. So the question is, what is the difference between hiking and walking outdoors? Semi-rhetorical for me. Because then it gets me to think about what is it about hiking as a social construct that we're communicating to a community. You want to be a part of this or not? And not understand the variety of reasons for why they might say, hiking, no, but walking outdoor, yes. Even if they might look exactly the same in terms of like what you're asking the body to do. But in terms of what you might be asking the cultural identity to do, it can be a different story and a different ask. So that's both the invitation, the challenge, and the opportunity about the work that we do when we talk about representation. It doesn't mean I don't want to do any more hiking. It means, can we do hiking that's also inclusive of me, rather than asking me to convert to you? And that question isn't saying that I'm devaluing you, I'm just asking you to also be a part. It may sound like a semantic kind of thing, but you'd be surprised at what that actually, that's real impact on people. So no surprise, a lot of communities, especially communities of color, we all actually love a lot of outdoor activities. They're actually over-index on care for the environment, willingness to pass conservation policies, to tax, like you name it. It's not the question of interest. The representation doesn't come from, let me phrase that. The lack of representation doesn't come from a lack of interest. Structural element in terms of inclusion. So I throw this at business people here. Colonization, oh no. It can be a word that for some people, just like diversity, it's a bigger word, and I'm going to disengage from it. But I'm presenting it here because the work that I also do is to be able to say, I don't want to be here to convince you that you just have to accept and take my mental model. I want to be able to present what the conversation looks like, so that you're at least aware and familiar with it. And then we can look at what are your entry points for it. Because we need you. We need everybody. We need the collective action to be able to create the future that we want. Otherwise, we're just kind of perpetuating some of the harmful systems. So this is why I point this here. This is off of Dr. Lupe and Maria shared this 2018 Pioneers, if I recall. This was kind of looking at colonization as the driver for kind of this system of harm, this web of harm. And then as a doctor, you can treat physical trauma in a sense like if arm is hurt, and here's I can tend to it. But what is like generational trauma? How do you treat that? And how do you acknowledge what some of the cause of that is? As well as how can historical generational trauma show up as physical trauma and not just say, well, where'd that come? Did you fall? No, I didn't fall, but every week I have to show up as myself, carrying a lot that other people don't know, and it takes a toll. You're moving through a space that has a high emotional labor, high emotional identity stress, and so on. And some people might be like, I have no idea what that means, what it looks like. So I can move in the world and just be. And someone else is asking you, think about what it would like to move in the world, and not fully be. What do you think that does to your wellness? And so the writer, Michelle Holliday, was looking at this and said, well, really thinking about what's the logic, what is the framing that drives colonization, and kind of looking at this mechanistic reductionist worldview, kind of like the language, that presents a logic that can justify how we other each other as well as other the land, other or non-human. And that's why I often look at this work as othering and belonging, which is what the Othering and Belonging Institute at our youth work is. But what are the conditions that we create for belonging? What does that mean? What are the conditions that we create for othering? And what does that mean? So when I say mechanistic reductionist worldview, then I look at how does that show up? And how does that show up in ways that might limit or reduce what inclusivity in the outdoors looks like, what diversity in the outdoors looks like, not just in the outdoors, but in all of our states. But especially, for example, in the outdoors with the work that I do. Because if we flip that to a life logic, a life honorable view, which the writer did here, we often see a lot of the words that we use in our conservation work, in our nature-based work. Words like stewardship, nature's abundance, regenerative development, thrivability. So I often think about kind of the systems we're fighting against, as well as the systems we're fighting for. We're not just limited in one because we kind of have to be doing the both. So I present this as the framing because then it's helped me both think about how am I approaching the work in ways that I'm trying to redesign, but also creating access points for different worldviews from different communities and how they have a relationship to land and to nature, and so forth, and how that's a value add to our collective work. So I present this is, so as was mentioned, I'm a product of the School of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan. So this is one of my professors, Dr. Raymond DeYoung. And when we were looking at that was to be able to say, well, how are we supporting people being the best selves in behavior change and conservation, for example? And one of those was to be able to acknowledge that how we begin to prioritize and value some ways of knowing and being and not others. And this was right before even just really looking at what that meant in DEIJ. Just kind of looking at environmental conservation. But I brought this out because it reminded me that I had saved this, a cultural bias against story. It says right there, Starvin describes the Western metaphor as one of mechanism. Our educational model based on the metaphor of mechanism is biased to explain natural occurrences through the movement of external forces, one against the other. So remind me of that example when I say mechanistic reductionist is that it tries to treat everything as the way that we derive value and truth and appreciating comes from this model. Now, if you're struggling a little bit with this, I'll have an example for you. Because for me, it was knowing I began that mind shift and then think about like, oh, so that's what that means. This is why a community is saying this in a way that I can actually understand where they're coming from versus thinking, well, that can't be right. Or that has to be incomplete. Or is that really going to work? That was not the point. So here's the data makes you credible, stories make you memorable. As a way to sometimes think about data can be really useful in particular ways that we collect it, accrue it, and what it tells us about us. And yet, it's not the only thing because as humans, I was telling some of the students earlier today, the rational person model says that if I just collect and give you all the best information, you're going to make the best decision. As humans, actually, we're highly irrational because we don't just go off of the best available information and data. We're also highly affective beings in terms of our emotions and our feelings and how that get into the play. We're highly influenced by our environments, both physical and non-physical environment. Think about how you would make a decision when you're on your own, sitting in focus versus with a group of friends. That comes into play and be able to say, maybe I'm not, maybe they're right. So it can be little things like that that begin to affect how we don't just go off of the data. We also go off of other things, and one of those powerful elements is narrative, it's story. And it helps both can support and contradict like how we view the world. I have two examples. One of them is to start with the data. So redlining is one, it's a current example based on data that's kind of hard to get away from. Redlining maps. First, let me ask somebody here, is there anybody here who is really familiar with redlining maps? When I say redlining maps, you know what I'm talking about? Couple hands? Okay. Is there anybody here, you can a little vulnerability, I know, but you're like, I've never heard redlining maps. What that means. I appreciate that. Thank you. So I say this because redlining maps are good over here. So redlining maps, the caption is also wrong, but redlining maps is looking at especially like the 1950s, for example, kind of 1930s into 1960s, but especially the 1950s after World War II. what they were is these maps made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the maps were meant to indicate, like looking at a city, looking at a neighborhood, and have a color associated to the neighborhood, like A, B, C, D, and say, this is a good neighborhood, we're willing to provide loans. This is not a good neighborhood, so just we're less willing to provide loans because they might default, the neighborhood is not in good condition, whatever it might be. But those weren't created purely of an assessment of the infrastructure. They were racially coded. What that means is that if you had a Black family that was ready to buy a home and they wanted to move into a neighborhood, take out these maps and see if that family wanted to move into a predominant white neighborhood, they'd be like, can't give you the loan. But we will give you the loan if you want to move to this neighborhood. So redlining maps are a really good example of how, when we talk about structural inequity or structural oppression, that it's not based just on the individual. It wasn't a Black family's individual choice to say we want to live here compared to there. There were structural elements at play that basically said, if you even want to be considered for a home loan, it has to be open. And so the different layers there was some of the individual bias of the loan officers that came into play, but also some of the structural biases in terms of federal money down to the state or regional funding system like a bank. And then you have these maps and how that money was made available. And so you have these maps. That's what I'm saying. Like that's the evidence that these actual maps were created and they exist. And that when we look at these maps now, even though technically and legally that policy is no longer in place, it's the same culturally, we're dealing with the consequences of that. And we can take those maps and then see how they actually correlate really well across a bunch of other elements, such as parks, urban heating, even during the COVID pandemic was where the cases were, bunch of health disparities, asthma. And so even though we're not saying, oh, the maps directly caused this, that correlation is an indicator being saying where we invested, where we put resources for it, where we're underinvesting, and the consequences of designing that spaces in a way that affect different communities based on race and ethnicity differently. And that if we don't redesign those maps, you can't be surprised if in 50 years they're still showing up. Because they're definitely still showing up 50 years from now from before. So that's when I think about like how the data can help, but then also we want to think about the story about how we're connecting to people to say, you are a part of this, you're part of the solution. So that's why. So let me take a step back. So on this one, this is recent from 2020 from Science, in which they took these redlining maps, right, to be able to look at disparity across race in urban environments based on these maps, and then say what happens to basically some of the ecology of these areas. So it says the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environment. Saying, let's look at these maps and what's showing up. And no surprise, what they were saying was, here are the redlining maps, Birmingham, Minneapolis, Phoenix, Baltimore. Saying, let's look at these maps and then look at what is showing up in terms of the urban ecology. And what they were saying was, you basically have less ecological diversity that correlates to some of these redlining. So I often share this to be able to say that even though redlining maps were started as a source of housing, they impact a lot of the other work that we do. So for example, access. By nature mean the actual green spaces, but also the non-human kin, the wildlife that reside in those spaces. And so that's how our work is connected. And sometimes people say, listen, I do nature-based, we're arming conservation, like whatever that social justice thing, topic that's important to you, I don't understand how that can be part of our work or our focus. They are connected. And there's a bunch of other examples I won't go through here, but this is one that I want to offer. And then the last one on this was the narrative example. It's this one. So if you major probably in environmental science studies, you might have heard the name Rachel Carson come up for the book Silent Spring. And so you have heard it. Think about the story that kind of begins to fill it. Think about how Rachel Carson noticed that DDT or these pesticides are a problem and we should do something about it. It was also not taken seriously and faced a lot of what I would say just straight up oppression and harassment based on her gender. Based on her gender. But to be clear, it was a white woman, but because being a woman, she's like, we're not really gonna take you seriously. She writes this book to kind of essentially say, our springs are going to be silent because we're going to kill all the birds from the impacts and effects of this pesticide. And so environmentalists say this isn't right. We're going to rally and get pesticides to be banned. And so that's kind of the story. So it's an important inflection point. It's a success story of environmental work. So without the 1972 ban on DDT and its human protectors, the bald eagle and peregrine falcon, let alone dozens of other birds species, would likely be gone in the US. We're like, yay, we did it. And so this is kind of the story. This is from 1997. So DDT and organochloride pesticide was widely used following World War II and devastated many bird populations by causing the birds to lay thin-shelled eggs that broke their incubation. The founders of EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, a well-known and highly resourced environmental group in the US, brought the original DDT lawsuit in Suffolk County, New York, where they showed that ospreys were having poor reproductive success and eggs that had not hatched contained high concentrations of DDT. The lawsuit ultimately led to a nationwide ban on DDT issued on June 14, 1972 by then EPA Administrator Lupe. So that's the kind of the story that becomes part of this work. What often isn't included or even isn't included to recently is that it's incomplete. So the focus here is on environmentalists, predominantly white environmentalists, coming in and saving the birds. What's not included, I won't read all of it, is that actually it was not the only lawsuit at play. There was an additional lawsuit in California by Chicano lawyer Rafael Abascal, on behalf of 6 migrant farm workers, was saying DDT is harming the people working in the field. And so what they were finding, though, is on the EDF side and the environmental side, it was hard to prove standing. So if you're a follower of kind of environmental law, you kind of first have to prove standing, like that the birds are being harmed and they have standing in court. You kind of first you have to prove that the harm is on people. So they were having difficulty kind of proving that nature, like the birds, for example, have standing in court. On the other side, with the migrant farm workers, they were having issues being resourced, being taken seriously. How are we going to? We need to be attentive to really take them seriously, because that could set another type of precedent. And so this marriage of convenience meant combining the lawsuits so that it could give standing. So CRLA, the California Rural Legal Assistance Organization, still around, not as highly resourced as EDF. If anyone on EDF from Zoom, no offense, I know a lot of good people that work at EDF. There's been a lot of work to change all of that. But what I'm saying is that they handed over the case to EDF, and that is what eventually led to the ban, because now you could prove that there was actually also harm on people. And yet, in kind of, you saw the EDF press release from 97. That's not mentioned at all. It's left out. And so this is part of that question where we say pesticides, while an important issue in their own right, became a metaphor for the larger power struggle that such a subaltern group as farm workers had the audacity to challenge agribusiness. Such to the point that nothing really was done with DDT and farm workers until relatively recently, and even some of them are still fighting back. It gets to some comments that some communities, especially communities of color, say endangered species have more protection than some of us. Which legally you might be like, well, do they or not? Also, besides the point of in practice, that is what comes across, and that is what they see and what they know. I actually took out 2 slides that were making that point around Cecil the lion. Maybe I'll come back to the end. So if you're familiar with Cecil the lion, I'll come back to the end. I also want to make sure. All right, perfect. Lots to finish here. And so for this one, these are the 2 source books if you're interested. Earlier, I got questions from faculty and staff about books. So this is Dr. Laura Pulido, who I references right here, Environmentalist and Economic Justice. And then that one is Robert Gottlieb, Foreseeing the Spring. So the last part I want to close with is how am I kind of applying and incorporating the expansion of these mental models? What does it look like to connect my outdoor work, nature access work with social justice work, and that they're actually informative and complementary to each other? In California, much of the American West has been suffering from highly destructive wildfires. That's to the point that we now have wildfire season during, like, you get just this black smoke. And as my friend and colleague at Stanford, Dr. Jorge Ramos, said that our past practices have caught up with us and are compounded by climate change. And by past practices, he means fire suppression in national forests. So Smokey the Bear kind of saying only you can prevent forest fires, which means any fire you saw, put it out. Any fire you saw, put it out. And we created an infrastructure just for that, to be able to put out any fire. And what we're now reconnecting to and understanding and appreciating is the value of prescribed burning that many Native communities actually did, and especially in fire adapted ecosystems, where you actually need a little bit of fire to be able to create the conditions for healthy succession. And that ecosystem can thrive with a certain degree of fire. And you saw, maybe it was a student poster just outside that was looking at fires and hurricanes, for example. Reading what does it look like when you have disturbance, good disturbance, I'll call it that, versus bad disturbance. And so I say this because then I think about, well, if we know we need prescribed burning with responsible fire tenders for a landscape, for an ecological thing, sometimes I ask, what is the prescribed burning for my social and cultural relational state? What is the fire suppression that we might be doing that then later something blows up and where did that come from? Why are people reacting this way? Well, because we created the conditions for that intensive destructive wildfires, and we have not supported the conditions for good fire. So look at what does tension and conflict look at in the way that we support each other to do some of that. And be like, I'm glad we did that. I'm glad we cleared that underbrush. So that example, when I was talking about reductive mechanistic language as an example how it can help us interrogate and push, I'd share that. Think about it if you've ever heard the expression, your team is functioning like a well-oiled machine. You might have heard that when somebody was saying, good job, you're all doing great, you're being efficient, like I'm really proud of the way that you're all working together. And then I might come and say, well, your team is functioning like a well-nurtured meadow, thriving meadow. And you might think, what does that mean? I say, well, what is the other one? Nothing wrong with machines, of course. Nothing, I'm not vilifying them in the way to say, like, throw out your phones and don't use cars. Ideally, for the long term, we want to do less of that. What I'm getting at is to be able to say, how does asking that invite us to think about what we're valuing in terms of relationship, in terms of outputs, in terms of leadership? Because especially all of us that do conservation or nature-based work, we're not gonna go to a meadow and say like, come on, meadow, like meadow better, right? You know that you're doing your best, especially in restoration work, to create the conditions for which the meadow can thrive. You're not out there planting every little single blade of grass. You're not out there introducing every little single element of the ecosystem. You're trying to support the conditions for which that regenerative cycle can help support that. Just like when you cut yourself, you go to the doctor, trying to create the conditions for your body to heal itself. Unless you're directly injecting, regenerative stem cells, you're really trying to provide the conditions to activate what is healing, what those healing cycles are already there. And so those are invitations that I sometimes ask to be able to say. I said, what prescribed birding shall we practice in our relational space? What is no longer needed? So that what is seeded may grow in healthy succession. And sometimes I might not have an answer, but the question can help set me in a different path than I was before. Are we grounded as a radical self, as I mentioned earlier, where respected habitats meet at that edge is the opportunity of creative abundance of different order making. Because I'd like to think about the ecotone between our work. And so how can we support an edge effect that creates that abundance rather than a border wall that I know is going to have a different impact. And then the last one is I share this because sometimes if you've ever maybe done a DEIJ workshop or you do this work, you come across some, the article or title that says like white dominant culture or tenets of white supremacy, and you're like, whoa, that's not me. Not saying you as an individual are representing all of that. It's asking us to say, is there a way in which the social and physical space, the infrastructure was set up such that you move in a way that you haven't questioned it, but others are constantly facing how it was not designed for them. And so this shift is being able to say, if we only value a particular set of knowing and being at the exclusion of others, we may be limiting ourselves and not inviting that value out of difference and diversity. So for example, if we're only doing either or thinking, or binary thinking, as we might say, we might ignore some of the systems and complexity thinking. It's abundant in nature, for example. And so we can ask what happens at times when we use both and instead of either or. And it's a little shift, but you can be surprised at what that can do. And for you might be like, it doesn't matter, but for somebody else it does. Because that but is a reminder of how their ideas and contributions are always that. Yeah, I heard you, but versus I heard you and I was thinking. Little shifts that communicate actually quite a few things. And so the last one here was this is the work of Dr. Vincent Basile out of Colorado State University. So I share this because sometimes people say, okay, great. So you're gonna go now on a group hike, or you're gonna create an experience for some of us to go outdoors. How do I take all of that? Like, give me something that I can try and practice. And so I like this because what he did was, this is his work is decriminalizing practices disrupting punitive-based racial oppression of voice of colors in elementary school class. So he's specifically looking at voice of color because the research shows that voice of color, usually, regardless of the race of the teacher, which is sad in its own thing, but regardless of the race of the teacher, they get the most called out for behaviors that kind of sets them on that school to prison type. What he calls criminalizing behaviors. They're acting out, being disrespectful. So we're saying, how can we flip that so that they are decriminalizing behaviors as an intervention? And so I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm going to read one that I really like, which is assuming brilliance. Begin an interaction with the boy of color, assuming what he has already done or said and what he's about to say and do are brilliant and intelligent. So for example, a teacher coming to a science table and seeing a large rock broken into tiny pieces in front of a boy of color and assuming the boy has just simulated erosion. Instead of showing up and say, what are you doing? You're making a mess. Or like, did you even listen to what the instructions were? You show up and say, like, this is fascinating. It looks like you're simulating erosion. Explain this to me. And then go from there. You might get a different response or you might not know, but if you're setting the conditions which are different and asking you to interrogate why you were starting with a different set of conditions. And so that presumption of brilliance, it's a little shift. And again, former teacher, I was actually the discipline and intervention teacher early in my career. So I say this from experience as well to say, it doesn't mean we're not still attending to quote unquote discipline and behavior issues. But I'm really thinking about what the foundation of where those are coming from versus what I'm presuming that they're prescribing. One time I had a student, I was reading the referrals and I'm like, how is it that you can sit in my room, which is meant to be quiet, punitive, face the wall, and do that? And you're getting kicked out of your classroom. You could be talking to your friend. I'm sure the teacher isn't having you always be quiet and exactly like this. And she was like, well, Mr. G, you respect. I had to sit with that. So I wasn't working for that. I wasn't trying to like give you some credit. It was just sat there and I'm like, let's see what that looks like. Because then that is how we can be supporting other teachers. I still have my terrible day, to be clear. But it was those little reminders about how we're creating the conditions to be able to have it. So with that, I want to say thank you. These are questions that can be helpful with that as we proceed this. So we have a question like, how does this lens change my understanding? I then kind of put in what we're working through. So how does this lens change my understanding of race dynamics in this community beyond the gender dynamics? As a way for me to invitation to think about how I might be receiving a new mental model, new information, new ways of being and connecting with others. And rather than being like, that can't be right, I can lean in with curiosity and a learning growth mindset and be like, how could that be different in ways that we can have abundance for power, expansion, and sharing versus I'm going to lose mine. I can't have that. Thank you.
Have plenty of time for questions. And if anyone in the room has a question, I am going to ask that you read it out into the microphone so that everyone on Zoom can hear it. So, anyone have a question for Jose?
Stick around.
We have questions on Zoom in the chat. There's one in the chat.
Can you read it out to us?
Okay, question from the chat. How do you consider and specifically reckon with the political forces beyond our personal behaviors that produce policy, may or may not create the very issues of impeding and restricting, as well as influence the cultural periods of time that influence defining principles?
Oh, good. Thank you. I think it's a great question because many of us are wrestling with that when we think about everything from political polarization to policy outcomes, administrative change, like you name it. It seems very here and now in ways that it hasn't been before. If we're a student of history, you know that's not the case, but it's very different. It can be very challenging for us to put ourselves, let's say, in 1962 or in 1862 or 1864 or 1962, and be like, oh wow, this is just as much. And I think what we are seeing and showing is, I think at least two things. One of them is you can't disengage from policy because it has real impact and effect. And so sometimes we have an expression when we say you can't be, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti. And that's also not saying that you as an individual are racist just by being. You can benefit from structural racism that was set up by people before you. And so with policy, I think about that because it can be easy to say, not worth it. We're being complicit in the harm and damage. it doesn't move fast enough. What's the point? And from a lot of my peers and colleagues that work in policy, they're like, the cost of not engaging often end up being a lot more harmful, in fact, way greater, and we're continuing perpetuating some of that. So I say that because some of the hard work that we often do is looking at how do we try to not create rigid radicalism. I mean, this is the only way that you can create change and disruption. So we're looking, what are all the Dr. Ira, I think, as like the social ecosystem roles of change that says, here are all the different ways that you can have a role to create change, as a visionary, as a healer, as a disruptor, as a storyteller, and those all can come have a play. So it doesn't mean that we're all going to be active in policy in the same way, but we can have an opportunity to be active in it, because I think not being active and having those that are active that really see the world differently in a way that those impacts are gonna with all of us, to me, that's kind of the real harm and challenge. And I say that because it's hard. A lot of the students yesterday asked, like, how do you reconcile? I'm like, I hear you. Reconcile makes it feel like I'm compromising in ways that are not good. But that's why I offer to say, well, have you done the values work? Have you created to be able to say, when you make a hard call, when you make a hard decision, what is the value you're anchoring on? So even if you have others not like it, you can still say it was values aligned versus, well, I did it this way now I did it this way now this way, and you really being reactive, I think really grounded it and kind of powerful. Might not be a complete and satisfactory answer, I know. But until I get a magic wand, it's part of the work that we do.
Another question from the chat. In the 6 conditions pyramid of systemic change, do you typically start with structural change and feed down into the mental models, or can the pyramid work the other way around?
Yes.
And would Silent Spring be an example?
Yes, exactly. That's a good question. I start from wherever there's opportunity. It doesn't mean you start from the top down or the bottom up. You can start from any of those. You can start all of them. Sometimes I'll look at that just to see what is the work that's happening in an organization, in a space, and realize a lot of fantastic structural work here and some really good relational work, but absolutely no mental model work. We should probably do something about that, because that plays a role in how we're facilitating or impeding some of these actions and behaviors. So if you have the person, all of a sudden you have a new person in charge, like the new president of the organization, that has a very different mental model, and don't be surprised if they start not funding some of the initiatives that are already there, that they start being resistant, right, to some of the activities or projects that are in place. We often see that happen in quite a few spaces.
We've got a question in the room back here.
Hi, wait, is this on? Oh, okay. Yeah. First, just thank you so much for your talk. So I'm a second-year PhD student here, and I was wondering if you had any advice or sort of things to talk about in terms of when people want to, or when people are struggling with sort of the activism component that they want, activism versus trying to be an objective research scientist here. And, sometimes people kind of get stuck with wanting to have a social or racial justice component of their academic PhD here, but they're told by faculty members that they have to be more objective and they can't really be an activist per se. Do you have any advice on like how faculty members or research and PhD academics can sort of bring in all the components of the things that you've been talking about today to their work?
Great question. What are the faculties are going to see what no, I mean, I was asked earlier, like, how can universities, like those systems change? And I said, that's a great question, because I start with 2 questions there. One of it's, what power are you willing to give up? Just to interrogate, see what comes out of that. Because you have power, I don't have any power. You probably start there to be like, you do. What does it look like? as I often say, is what power then, conversely, what power are you holding on to or willing to hold on to, even so tightly such that it harms another? So ideally, you don't want to be doing that. And if you do, then that creates a very clear boundary for which I don't want to engage with. Because then you might be able to say, well, maybe this is what the power looks like, and ask, why are we holding it in this way? Is it just because it's always been this way? Is it because it basically is an actual harm? Is it illegal? Like you can have your reasons. And then the second question is in service of what? So when it comes to this, to say, we say objective, there's conversation as to say, well, it's not completely accurate. Objectivity in science, it's a nice construct, but often it's not interrogated in ways to be able to say, that's not actually true. There is a culture to science. There is a way in which biases show up and how researchers show up in the work. And that's not, for me, the way that I see it, it's not automatic if it's bad. It's just concerning when you feel like you have removed yourself from that space of equation. And so when it comes to activism, I often say, well, tell me more about the action. What does it look like? What is it in service of? How does this align with kind of like the work that we're doing? Because in some other spaces, those are not as mutually exclusive as we set them out to be in spaces like this. Because we might be saying, I want you to be objective. Really, maybe it's a different question to say, I'm concerned about how this might compromise the way in which the study or area might be perceived in this audience. I'd be like, let's talk about that, which is very different than thinking I'm creating objectivity in a way that removes some elements that are really important.
There's this question in the chat and in Spanish, so
Vale.
you can translate what I'm going to say in a better word. Antonella de la Torre dice, muchas gracias por la charla y quería preguntarle si podrías tomar un poquito de tiempo para describir lo que significa in service of what.
So the question is being asked to take some time. What do we mean by in service of what? Lo digo porque, para do the translation, servicio para qué? But in service of what is meant to ask, what is the values aligned foundation for which I'm doing this? And I try to say values aligned because it's not values aligned, then that could be a different part of the question. Why am I doing this? So if I'm doing it because I'm scared, that's fair. Not, at least I'm kind of owning it. I'm doing it because I'm angry, fair. I have an emotion around it. My question is to be able to say, is that why you want to do it? Then don't be surprised about the consequences of the action. And be like, well, where did that come from? How would you react if faced with anger? Don't be surprised if somebody reacts in the same way or fear removes from the conversation rather than you thinking, they should have just accepted it and heard me. And as humans, that's not how it works. So that's what I mean about in service of what? As well as sometimes we say, oh, because I really care about this community and I just want them to be better. Okay, that's a good intention. How could that land as an impact if you're doing it just from your lens? And it might be paternalistic saviorism, because you're saying you know what's best. I would ask, are you really familiar and aware with that, what the community has asked for? And have you honored that? So in service of what at least gets me to pause is like, pues, ¿por qué lo estoy haciendo? En realidad, honestamente, ¿cuál es la razón de la que me interesa tanto tratar de hacer este proyecto, este trabajo, o tratar de ayudar y preguntarme, ¿lo estoy ayudando porque les quiero apoyar o porque es para mí? Now, when you apologize, for example, you say, are you apologizing because you want to feel good? Fair, but that's not really the apology for it. Apology is meant to be able to let the other individual know you're acknowledging what the harm was. You can choose not to apologize as well, but then just don't be surprised that that doesn't give you what you were hoping was a resolution.
Any questions in the room? Any others on the chat? Oh, okay.
Okay, what can land managers do to make nature preserves, trails, and outdoor spaces feel more inclusive and welcoming?
I know that can be a long answer, so I will say two things to at least start. In addition to the questions that I said, like what power are you willing to give up in service of what does inclusion look like? One is, can you identify the ways in which you have clear information from the various communities that both you know access, and then you don't know if they access or not, that preserve that space? Like what lets you know that something is working and not working? Because sometimes then you might say, right, I do maybe need a better relationship with the community-based organization to have data that is needed. The second one is just like the decriminalizing behaviors. If you're out there, if you have a team that manages it, if it's a park ranger, if you call the sheriff in for issues, whatever it might be, is remember that those interactions, asking where is their starting point? I would have a lot of Spanish-speaking dads especially say, we just stopped going to some of these spaces because sometimes we didn't know where to get the permit or do all of this stuff. So we would show up and the first question we get asked, do you have a permit? Not even how are you? Do you need help with anything or even a greeting? It was, do you have a permit for that? And we're like, it's too familiar to them about their interactions with law enforcement. So those kind of conditions.
And also there are a lot of thank yous and compliments in the chats too as well. This person asks, how do you fight against perceptions that people of color don't have a lot of experience with parks, so there's no need to do things such as provide Spanish language on brochures, or that people don't know how to follow like leave no trace, etc.?
Question. We would often get some of those comments like, we can't have more, families out there. Just create a mess. I was like, we all create a mess. And that's why we have leave no trace in the first place as this kind of Western European centric remedy to what we cast as the problem. And the Native community is like, we don't need leave no trace. We were fine without it, without you. And now you're telling us we can't harvest. So what I mean of that is the conversations matter. And being able to really connect people to the value out of the space and thinking about, we often say, declarative and procedural information and knowledge as to creating those conditions for co-ownership. So the perception is real in terms of people's stereotype, but I've often found that being able to not attribute that to like the race or ethnicity. Technology can be a very human thing for us to trash the environment, and being able to, like I said, not make that perception connection, and be able to say, how can we care for the space? But why do you value coming here? How can we ensure that this continues to be an amazing opportunity for you? Or like, are you also happy that this has this much trash? And most of the time we found this like, no. And it's everything from like, we keep asking for trash cans and you don't put them, or I get it, you're asking us to kind of bring our own trash bags, but sometimes we can't because of A, B, C, and D, and you're taking that as we don't care, whereas we are coming from a different set of challenges. Put that in terms of that's not easy, but like in urban greening work, people would often say, great, we're going to plant native trees and take out all of these fruit trees that are not native to the neighborhood. And the neighborhood's like, whoa, what are you doing? You're taking something that's actually important. I'm still good, but I want to recognize if people need to head out.
I think we can continue for just a few more minutes, but just so that everyone's aware, there is another seminar in this space in 30 minutes. So we will want to be respectful of that. And it's a really cool seminar. So if you want to put off your work for a little bit longer, it's about parasites and their host interaction. Yeah, very cool stuff. So yeah, I'll give us a few more minutes to keep going with these questions, but just so you know.
Okay, another question. This is a fun one. Who or what first inspired you to get outdoors?
Lots of many people, but I'll just name one, which was one of my grandparents, granddad, who always wears huaraches. Didn't bring mine today. To this day, I just saw him last week. 88 years old now. Still is out there. I try to get by him a pair of hiking boots once. He's like, why would I want that? So that reminds me of like what it means to actually be out.
This person says, I am a master's student in conservation in the UK. We have been learning about decolonizing environmental education programs, and I'd love to hear how you've gone about teaching through a decolonization frame and your experience as an educator.
Oh goodness, that's another good question. I actually have a whole different side when we talk about decolonization because the term that often comes up. And I kind of say decolonizing is not a metaphor. Colonizing can be a metaphor to both honor. There's a paper that's titled that decolonizing is not a metaphor. And what that's trying to get at is being able to say that often it's being used in reference to land back, which just means return native land. So it's a way to honor that. And often when we talk about decolonization, we're probably referencing decoloniality. Not to get overly semantics, but what we're getting at the decoloniality is what I was showing about what is the colonial structure that said, this is how we want to value something and for these reasons. And how do we create the conditions that we can value beyond that? So for environmental education, for me, what that has meant is thinking, I'm going to go, for example, on a birding walk with the group. I don't take my lesson plan and say, this has the academic rigor with the learning outcomes and goals, and now they just need to be the people need to be inputs in it. I'm able to say, I have this as a resource and reference, but there's all kinds of community knowledge and expertise, a non-Eurocentric degree, expertise in this community. Let's see how these come together and be able to make sure that they're not merely seen as objects of programming, that they're not treating as individuals, for whom they need to be converted or to be extracted from. And that's what I mean about like the colonial mentality that they would say, I know what's best.
One more question. How do you think we should challenge fear that people may have about interacting with the outdoor environments, specifically with having law enforcement as rangers, wardens, and wildlife officers?
Yeah, and one of them is being able to work with those institutions. The reality is we still have them. That's part of it. And that's a lot of work. Where it's a lot of work. On the other, if you're not the law enforcement entity, if you're like the hike leader or whatever it might be, is to not be dismissive as a start, but to be able to start where they are in terms of that fear base and then work with them. So as an example, sometimes we get families who say like, I don't want to go out there because a bear eats me. Actually, bears may no longer be in that area, like they're not native or we wipe them out. But rather than you say like, you got nothing to worry about, there's no bears. That doesn't actually work with them. I'm able to say, well, let's do this. Let's show up and let's look at all the ways in which we're accounting for safety such that bears will not be an issue of concern. While this is the risk management taking. You can still choose not to go, but what I'm just saying is like the fear of the bear, I think is going to prevent you from having an amazing experience. Or with kids in Spanish, they would often say, Cucuy is going to get us, like the boogeyman in the dark. And with them, I'd be like, worry not, I got like the special Cucuy perimeter zone. And they would laugh about it, but it wasn't me trying to be dismissive. And so there's different practices in which you're connecting to where they're coming from rather than being dismissive about it. Because again, that arrogance of expertise can show up in many different ways.
All right. I just want to thank everyone again for joining us today. And can we give Jose another round of applause?